Hey guys, tonight we begin with a velvet-lined doctor's office in Victorian London. It smells like coal smoke and lavender oil. Outside, horses clatter along damp cobblestones. Inside, a woman has just gracefully fainted onto a chaise lounge. Her fourth spell this week. You probably won't survive this next 2 hours without raising your eyebrows, at least twice. Yes, once or twice. And quietly realizing that, yes, there was a time when doctors routinely gave women orgasms and called it medicine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing your cozy corners from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing beside a walnut writing desk. The doctor, Dr. Edward Clark, is adjusting his cuffs. It's the 1860s. London is gray and rainy, and he's already exhausted from his third patient of the morning. Her symptoms? Not unusual. Fatigue, mood swings, chest tightness, weeping, headaches, a sense of floating. The diagnosis, hysteria, a condition so broad and vague that it could apply to virtually anything a woman felt that day. Anxious, hysteria. Too quiet, hysteria. Too loud, you guessed it, hysteria. Dr. Clark reaches for his well-thumbed medical journal. There, once again, is the recommended treatment. Pelvic massage to induce hysterical paroxysm. Let's stop right there, because you deserve to know what that means. A hysterical paroxysm was an orgasm. That's the polite, clinical, elbow-patched phrase they used, and pelvic massage was the method performed by the physician by hand as a medical procedure, fully clothed, very serious, all in a day's work. And yes, that pelvic massage terminology means exactly what you think it means: manual stimulation on female private parts. There was a period in Western medical history, longer than you might expect, when doctors routinely gave women orgasms, not for pleasure, not for intimacy, but because they believed it was a valid treatment for hysteria, a catch-all condition mostly defined by being inconvenient and female. And before you imagine this as anything remotely steamy, you don't. This wasn't candlelight and music. This was a straight-backed medical appointment. Lace gloves, gas lamps, a very tired man who sometimes saw a dozen hysterical women in a single afternoon. In fact, many doctors found the process exhausting. Manual stimulation could take a long time. Some patients were unresponsive, while others needed 30 to 40 minutes before reaching the prescribed relief, and so it became a chore. But despite the nature of what they were doing, neither doctor nor patient was supposed to think of it as sexual. That would have been inappropriate. No, this was science. This was releasing bodily congestion. This was, in one very real way, the world's most awkward form of preventive care. So why were women being treated this way? Well, let's zoom out for a second. In Victorian society, women were expected to be delicate, submissive, and nearly asexual. Their role was to marry, raise children, and quietly disappear between the drapes when anyone mentioned the word desire. Yet under those corsets and tight social rules, real people still existed. Women who felt things, wanted things, hurt in ways that doctors didn't understand or take seriously. So when a woman began showing signs of emotional distress, tension, or even basic frustration, medicine had to find an explanation that didn't involve saying, maybe she's lonely, maybe she's bored, maybe she wants something she's not allowed to want. Thus hysteria. And the solution to hysteria? Well, if you were a doctor in 1860, it looked like this. Glove up. Maintain a neutral facial expression. Stimulate the patient until she experienced what was described, very earnestly, as a release of nervous energy. Once she sighed, relaxed, and said thank you, appointment over. Next patient. The thing is, nobody said the word orgasm. Not out loud, not in journals. That would have been improper. You couldn't even say leg at the dinner table. But everyone involved sort of knew, and also sort of pretended not to. It was a system built entirely on plausible deniability, and yet it worked. For the patients, it often brought genuine relief. For the doctors, it was another notch on the day's ledger. And for the culture, it allowed everyone to keep pretending that female sexuality didn't exist, because if it did, then this entire practice would suddenly feel a lot more complicated. You stand there now, in that little gaslit room, thinking about what it means to medicalize pleasure, to turn touch into therapy, and to call an orgasm something like a local convulsion of the nerves. It's absurd, but it's also true. And as strange as this may sound, the story's just getting started. Because eventually, doctors would grow tired of doing all this by hand. They'd want something faster, more efficient, less awkward. And when the Industrial Revolution came along with its wires and gears and buzzes, it brought exactly what they needed. But we're not there yet. For now, just take a moment to let this all sink in. A real, historical moment when women were given orgasms by physicians, and nobody was allowed to say the word out loud. You're still standing in Dr. Clark's office, or rather drifting quietly through it, like a curious ghost with an internet connection. Outside, a soft drizzle taps the window. Inside, there's a faint smell of antiseptic and roses. The woman on the fainting couch is buttoning her gloves. Refreshed and relieved, the doctor checks his schedule. 5 more hysteria cases today. You glance again at the diagnosis. Hysteria. So what exactly is hysteria supposed to be? Well, that's the fun part. No one ever really knew. But that didn't stop them from diagnosing it constantly, aggressively, and almost exclusively in women. To be labeled with hysteria in the 1800s, you didn't need a specific symptom or even a pattern. You just needed to be a woman doing anything that made a man vaguely uncomfortable. Sadness, hysteria. Irritability, hysteria. Insomnia, digestive complaints, reading too many novels, having opinions, all hysteria. One medical textbook from the 19th century listed over 75 symptoms. Included among them were things like nervousness, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, shortness of breath, tendency to cause trouble in the home, excessive talking, not enough talking, and, my personal favorite, a general tendency to cause concern. You could be diagnosed with hysteria, whether you were lively or lethargic, outspoken or withdrawn, hungry or nauseous. It was the ultimate one-size-fits-all diagnosis. And to be clear, it wasn't just a label. It came with treatments, with consequences, with real interventions. Sometimes it meant a week of bed rest and supervised naps. Other times, it meant a doctor-prescribed orgasm, delivered through a process so euphemized and buttoned up that it barely felt real. You picture it now, a respectable woman, escorted into the exam room by her husband or chaperone. She describes her symptoms delicately. Some fatigue, perhaps a little unease in the chest. The doctor nods, listens attentively, and then recommends what the journals call pelvic massage until paroxysm is achieved. It sounds absurd now, like a Monty Python sketch gone too far. But back then, it was common practice, and almost no one talked about what it really was. Because the truth was awkward. Orgasm, in the 19th century, wasn't something women were supposed to feel, much less need. If it happened in marriage, it was viewed as a biological side effect, possibly helpful for conception, but nothing more. So when women began experiencing this paroxysm in a clinical setting, sometimes for the first time in their lives, it had to be rebranded. It wasn't pleasure. It wasn't sexual. It was therapeutic. And that made it safe. Safe for the patient. Safe for the doctor. Safe for a society that couldn't quite face the idea that women might have internal lives of their own, much less sensual ones. But of course, people aren't set that simple. Some patients returned frequently. Some reported that their symptoms only returned after long absences. Others recommended the procedure to friends. And slowly, behind all the euphemisms in medical charts, a quiet truth began to hum beneath the surface. This wasn't set about disease. This was about touch, about recognition, about a need that society wouldn't acknowledge. So medicine had to pretend it was something else. And here ests the twist. Doctors weren't trying to be devious. Most of them genuinely believed they were helping. They saw themselves as professionals doing a very difficult, very repetitive task. They weren't titillated. They were tired. There are stories, some likely true, of doctors developing wrist pain and finger strain from performing this treatment so often. One noted physician in New York described it as a tedious and uncomfortable method, often requiring multiple sessions and considerable patience, which is part of why, as the 19th century moved forward, some doctors started to wish there were a better way, a tool, a device, something that could create the same result without the hand cramps. And guess what? The age of electricity had just arrived, but we shall get to the machinery soon enough. For now, let's circle back to the big question. How did hysteria become such a go-to diagnosis? The short answer? Because it solved a lot of problems for a society that didn't want to talk about women's real issues. You see, real emotional distress, grief, frustration, trauma, mental illness would have required real conversations, real empathy, real reform. But labeling a woman as hysterical allowed everyone to skip that step. Hysteria turned legitimate pain into a tidy medical condition. It gave doctors something to write on the chart. It gave husbands a reason to dismiss their wives' complaints. It gave women an answer, even if it wasn't the one they actually needed. And maybe, just maybe, it gave a few women something else. Something their marriages didn't. Something their culture didn't. Something their doctors didn't realize they were giving. So here we are, a vague, misunderstood condition, a misunderstood solution, and a society too polite to name the one thing at the center of it all: pleasure. But don't worry, we're not staying vague for long, because as soon as the Industrial Revolution kicks in, this entire story takes a sharp turn into gears, wires, and steam-powered, well, you'll see. You're still here, still in that quietly humming room, with the velvet chaise, the low-burning gas lamps, and the ever-so-faint ticking of a wall clock that's losing time. Dr. Edward Clark reappears from behind a folding screen, his hands freshly washed, dabbing at them with a linen towel. His movements are unhurried, methodical. You can tell he's done this before, likely dozens of times. He gives a polite nod to the woman now rising from the fainting couch. She thanks him softly, smoothing her skirts. Her cheeks are pink, her expression unreadable. The housemaid is waiting just outside the curtain to escort her out. Another successful appointment, another relieved patient, another unexplained moment tucked neatly into polite society's blind spot. Dr. Clark glances down at his schedule and sighs. 5 more to go. You float quietly to his side now, watching over his shoulder as he tidies the space. There's a neatness to everything. The folded cloths, the porcelain water bowl, the tray of lavender-scented oil. There's even a small footstool near the patient's end of the chaise, just high enough for support during what's called very carefully treatment of the pelvic region for nervous agitation. It's all so deliberate, so precise. You look around the room again. No suggestive furniture, no gauzy curtains or plush mattresses, just a plain medical table, a sturdy writing desk, and a row of labeled jars on the wall: tonics for sleep, drops for digestion, powders for feminine delicacy, the tools of the trade. Now, the next patient arrives. She's in her 30s, dressed neatly, expression tight. She says her name is Mrs. Penelope Graves. She's been feeling a certain tightness in the chest, she says, difficulty sleeping, some moments of irrational crying. Dr. Clark listens with the practiced face of someone trained not to react. He asks a few questions about her digestion, her appetite, her mood, her monthly cycles, whether she's had thoughts of danger, falling, fainting, fleeing. She answers in clipped phrases, and you can see it happening, that invisible pivot, not toward madness, not toward diagnosis in the modern sense, but toward a ritual, one built on layers of performance. He nods, writes something in his notebook, then says the words that so many Victorian women would come to recognize as the threshold of a very strange medical rite. Well then, Mrs. Graves, I believe a brief application of the pelvic technique may provide some relief. There it is again, that phrase. Pelvic technique. No one ever says what it is. Not directly, but everyone seems to know. She glances at the screen, the one dividing the examination area from the rest of the office. She nods once, and then the procedure begins. You observe quietly, not intruding, just listening to the rhythm of a world pretending not to understand itself. First gloves, always gloves. This is a sterile procedure after all. Then a warm compress, placed gently on the lower abdomen to stimulate circulation. Dr. Clark murmurs reassurances in a low voice, professional and practiced. His hand moves slowly, methodically, following a motion likely learned through years of clinical repetition. The goal is a release of nervous energy, of congestion, of whatever invisible imbalance Victorian medicine blamed this week. You can see the concentration in his face. Not romantic, not lascivious, just tired. This is hard work, repetitive, straining. He even flexes his wrist at one point to ease a cramp. And Mrs. Graves? She exhales, not dramatically, not in some sweeping opera gesture, just a small breath. Her shoulders drop a little, her jaw loosens, and after a few moments of stillness, she adjusts her skirt, rises carefully, and thanks the doctor for his time. He nods again, still professional, still distant, and adds a quick note to her chart. Symptom reduction, moderate, recommend follow-up in 10 days. And just like that, it's done. There's something deeply surreal about witnessing this moment with modern eyes, because you understand exactly what just happened, even if no one in the room is allowed to say it. You think about how many times a week this scene must play out, in homes and offices all across the city. Women arriving with vague discomfort, societal tension, loneliness, sexual frustration, and leaving slightly more at ease, never fully knowing why. And Dr. Clark? He's no villain here. In fact, in his mind, he's serving science. The journals he studies say this treatment is safe, effective, non-invasive. There are even diagrams, detailed, labeled anatomical charts showing where to apply pressure, how long to continue the motion, and what signs to look for, indicating a successful result. Not a whisper of anything untoward, just physiology, nerves, muscle tone, circulation. You find one of those journals now on his desk. Its title, The Modern Practitioner's Manual for the Restoration of Nervous Harmony in the Female Body. You flip through its pages, finding phrases like pelvic congestion, restorative manipulation, and feminine neurosis responsive to mechanical agitation. Yes, it's all coded. Every sentence is like a puzzle, written to say something without really saying anything. Because here's the truth, no one writes down. This is about pleasure, or more precisely, this is about denying that it's pleasure, because if it were, everything about this treatment would become morally suspect, unprofessional, dangerous. So they hide it under layers of clinical language, build fences of Latin and leather-bound etiquette around something deeply human. And what's even stranger is that it works, not just as a treatment, but as a social valve. These women return regularly. They report improvements. They refer friends. Entire households adjust their schedules around visits to physicians like Dr. Clark. It's the most intimate appointment of their lives, and they talk about it as if it's a cough syrup refill. You wonder if that's why it's persisted for so long, because it's just ambiguous enough to be acceptable, just helpful enough to be marketable, and just veiled enough to avoid scandal. But there's a problem brewing. Dr. Clark doesn't know it yet, but soon he'll be overwhelmed. His wrists will ache. His schedule will fill beyond reason. He'll have a waiting list, a reputation, and eventually he'll realize that what he needs is a shortcut, a way to do what he does, faster, more efficiently, more comfortably, something with gears maybe, something that plugs in. But that, dear listener, is a story for another day. For now, let the soft tick of the clock guide you out of the room. Let the hush of coal smoke and rosewater fade behind you, because the future, electric, buzzing, and deeply awkward, is just around the corner. You slip softly into the next room, not literally, of course, but in that drifting, dreamlike way where everything feels slightly slowed down, like turning the pages of a diary that isn't yours, but might have been. You stare still following Dr. Clark, but now he sits no longer alone. It's the end of the week, and he sits at a small medical gathering, not quite a conference, more like a gentleman's set study group, the sort where well-fed doctors smoke cigars, sip brandy, and pretend they aren't exhausted by the sheer volume of women suffering from nervous ailments. One of them is holding court, a portly man with a walrus mustache and a gleam of pride in his eyes. He's passing around a pamphlet, something new, something clever, designed to ease the practitioner's sit's burden, he says, while delivering swift relief to the afflicted lady. The other doctors chuckle, nod, raise eyebrows, and Dr. Clark, skeptical but curious, takes the pamphlet. On the cover, in ornate print, the Granville percussion hammer, for gentle vibratory application in the treatment of female disorders. You read the subtitle again. Percussion hammer. Sounds like a Victorian rock band, but what it actually refers to is the first widely known medical vibrator. A tool, a device, a shortcut. You flip the page. Inside are hand-drawn illustrations of a bulbous-headed wand connected by a long cord to a winding, gear-driven motor. The idea is simple. Rather than performing the treatment by hand, the device applies rhythmic pulses to the patient's lower abdomen, guided by the physician. You can almost hear the sales pitch now. Saves time, reduces wrist fatigue, increases patient turnover. You remember what this treatment really is, and that is what makes the language so strange. Because no one, not the doctor, not the inventor, not the patient, is allowed to call this machine what it clearly, obviously is, an orgasm delivery system. They don't say arousal, they say nerve relief. They don't say sexual tension, they say pelvic congestion. And the device, it's not called a vibrator, it's called a percussive therapy instrument. Victorian medicine, in all its genius, wrapped eroticism in science until it disappeared behind a fog of polite euphemisms. Now, let's back up. How did this even come to pass? Well, the idea of using mechanical devices to relieve symptoms wasn't new. Doctors had already begun experimenting with electrotherapy, hydrotherapy, and other modern techniques that involved stimulating nerves and improving circulation. In fact, one early prototype of the vibrator was essentially a hand-cranked egg beater with a sponge on the end. You'd turn the crank, it would vibrate, the patient would recline, and then, after a few minutes of targeted application, she'd report a curious sense of lightness. And so the logic went, if this helped, if it made the crying stop, if it made the tension vanish, if it made the patient return home slightly less difficult, then surely it was good medicine. That's what the doctors believed, or at least told themselves. You drift back now to Dr. Clark's clinic. A few weeks have passed. He's since received the new instrument. It arrives in a velvet-lined box, like a violin or something precious. He opens it slowly. The cord is coiled like a snake. The main unit hums softly when powered on, its tiny engine whirring with the comforting sound of progress. He reads the instructions carefully, tests the pressure settings, times the treatment intervals, and then at 2:30 p.m., with his third patient of the day, he uses it. You watch from your quiet corner as the process unfolds. The same steps, the warm cloth, the gloves, the calm voice. But this time, instead of manual therapy, the doctor applies the rounded end of the Granville hammer to the patient's lower abdomen. The gentle vibration begins. The patient closes her eyes. 3 minutes pass, then 5. Then quietly, she exhales. Shoulders relax. She murmurs a thank you. Yists faster, more consistent, less awkward. And just like that, everything changes. Because Dr. Clark is not the only one. Soon physicians across England and across the Atlantic, in New York and Boston, begin ordering similar machines. Some are steam-powered, others are spring-loaded. A few use foot pedals. One even uses water pressure from indoor plumbing. Each one promises a faster, cleaner, more scientific way to relieve female tension. And women respond. Appointments increase. Patient lists swell. Clinics become busier. Some doctors begin training their assistants, or even wives, to use the devices when their own hands grow tired. And all the while, no one says the word orgasm. Instead, they say things like paroxysmal discharge of morbid fluid, a culmination of nervous excitation, resolution of pelvic pressure. And you can help but marvel at how a society so obsessed with modesty accidentally invented a medical orgasm machine and called it a nerve tonic applicator. The irony is too delicious, but it doesn't stop there. Soon advertisements begin to appear, not in seedy corners, but in respected women fix magazines. The Ladies' Sexed Home Journal, for example, ran ads for vibrating chairs, handheld tonics, and belt-mounted stimulators, all promising to restore youthful vitality and soothe feminine upset. None of it explicitly erotic, all of it unmistakably so. And the women who bought them, they weren't fools. They weren't confused. Many knew exactly what these machines did, but as long as no one said it out loud, they were allowed to keep buying them, to keep using them, to keep returning to the fainting couch with their cheeks a little flushed. You let that sink in now, the strange, bittersweet brilliance of it all, that in a time when women were not allowed to own their pleasure, medicine gave them just enough to survive, wrapped in velvet boxes, tied in silk cords, buzzing faintly behind closed doors. And the doctors, they went along with it, because it made their work easier, because it brought patients back, because it let them keep practicing science without ever having to talk about sex. But underneath it all, the machine was humming, and something had shifted. You hear it now, the faint whir of gears turning, somewhere just beyond the curtain. It's gentle, almost soothing, like the low buzz of a sewing machine, or the soft purr of an electric fan on a summer night. Except this hum isn't coming from the kitchen or the parlor. It's coming from a medical instrument designed to relieve what doctors politely call nervous afflictions of the female temperament. You followed the sound back into Dr. Clark's office, but the room has changed. There's more equipment now. A power cable snakes across the polished floorboards. The tray beside the patient's couch holds not just gloves and oil, but a shining metal device with a bell-shaped head and a curious little motor inside. And sitting beside it, clipboard in hand, expression neutral, is Dr. Clark, now deep in the rhythm of 1880s medicine. This is the new normal. Steam power, clockwork precision, mechanical modesty. Because for the first time in history, doctors have found a way to turn physical therapy into something nearly automatic, all without technically acknowledging that they're treating anything other than nerves. Let's take a closer look at the machine. It's called the Chattanooga Vibratory Device, or sometimes White's Exciting Generator. Some are floor-mounted, others are handheld. A few weigh over 40 pounds and require 2 people to move. And yet, they sell by the hundreds. Hospitals begin installing them in their women's wards. Sanatoriums advertise them as part of a new electrotherapeutic suite. One London asylum even boasts of having the most advanced vibratory interventions available for hysterical conditions. But don't let the clinical names fool you. These machines are quite literally, orgasm engines. And they work more efficiently than the hand, less awkward than explanation, faster than fainting couches and spoonfuls of tonic. You can see why doctors like them. They ser time savers. They ser risk savers. They're reputation savers. And patients. They Satra responding, with glowing testimonials like, "I felt a lightness I have not known in years. My color has returned. I no longer cry at night, nor dream of falling into nothing," which sounds poetic, if not a little dramatic. But that hits part of the mystery here, because these women aren't imagining their symptoms. They're not hysterical in the way the textbooks claim. They're lonely, exhausted, undervalued, silenced, pressured to be delicate, devoted, and sexually passive, all while managing households, enduring miscarriages, and surviving in a society that treats their pleasure like a dangerous rumor. So when a machine comes along and offers something real, even if it's wrapped in euphemism, they take it, gladly. And here is the part that will sound oddly familiar. Once the machines catch on, they go mainstream. Not in a tabloid sort of way, not yet, but in that slow, polite Victorian way, where something starts in a doctor's office, then shows up in a department store catalog, and before long it says available by post with discreet packaging. Harrods sold them. So did Sears. Eventually, catalog descriptions were gloriously vague, promising deep muscular stimulation, invigoration of the feminine constitution, and relief from sedentary strain. But behind those pretty words was a clear subtext. Ladies, here is a machine that will make you feel better. You don't need to ask permission, and you don't need to call it anything other than therapeutic. Of course, that's not to say everyone was fooled. There were whispers, housemaids gossiping in laundry rooms, husbands making sideways remarks, a few clergymen clutching their pearls and condemning the rise of electromechanical lustfulness. But for the most part, the system held, as long as doctors kept calling it science, and as long as women kept framing it as medicine. The whole thing moved forward, even when it became clear that some patients were scheduling weekly sessions for years, even when some doctors quietly admitted that the machines were perhaps a bit too effective, even when, and this is true, inventors started developing attachments, accessories, and settings to accommodate individual sensitivity levels, because this wasn't instead just a device anymore. It was a revolution hiding in plain sight, a quiet rebellion, powered by steam, backed by science, and fueled by a need no one was willing to name. You take a moment to imagine it now, a drawing room in Bath, a respectable woman with a respectable income. She orders the domestic nerve revitalizer for her health. It arrives in a box, labeled kitchen appliance. She unpacks it, sets it down beside her chaise, and closes the curtains. No shame, no scandal, just the soft, mechanical hum of a society pretending not to know what it knows. And here sets the oddest part. The doctors, for all their supposed ignorance, weren't all blind to it. Some began noting in their casebooks that patients often displayed unusual enthusiasm for treatment. One even wrote, somewhat dryly, "The afflicted ladies appear quite loyal to their appointments regardless of symptom severity." Another described a new issue. The treatment was working too well, as in, the relief was so complete, so repeatable, that patients no longer wanted a cure, they wanted continuation. And isn't that the strangest thing? When a supposed illness provides access to pleasure that society won't allow, nobody actually wants to get better. They want the appointment, they want the device, they want a reason. And so the diagnosis remains: hysteria, a problem with no clear origin, a symptom of being too loud, too sad, too tired, too female. And as long as the diagnosis exists, so does the treatment, which means the machines keep humming. You drift now through one more appointment. This time in a small-town clinic outside Manchester, a younger physician is testing out the new featherlight oscillating handle on a particularly persistent case of hysteria. His notes read, no response at first, increased speed, slight improvement, continued for 10 minutes. Patient thanked me, scheduled follow-up. That sits it. No fireworks, no euphemisms. Just the quiet paperwork of pleasure, dressed as medicine. And all the while, no one says what this really is. Desire. And more than that, access. Access to sensation, to attention, to care. Even if it's mechanical, even if it's framed as something else entirely. Because in the end, these devices did more than vibrate. They disrupted. They opened a tiny crack in a very old wall, and whether anyone admitted it or not, that wall was beginning to tremble. You're still here. Somewhere between a Victorian clinic and a late-night history rabbit hole, the room has quieted now. The machine is off, the patient is gone, and Dr. Clark is refilling his inkwell, readying his notes for the next day's ledger, but you're not watching him anymore. You're watching the silence around him, because for all the buzz and brass of the vibrator age, there rests something else humming in the background, something louder than steam, subtler than clockwork, silence, a great big, awkward silence around what these devices were actually doing. Because here sits the strange part. No one called it sexual, not in the ads, not in the journals, not in the waiting rooms, and certainly not out loud, which makes you wonder, how did they keep the lie going for so long? Let death start with the language. Victorian medicine was nothing if not committed to the art of euphemism. They had phrases for everything, long, dusty, Latin-influenced phrases that made the simplest things sound like divine punishments. A woman having a panic attack, exhibiting signs of female instability. A woman having the audacity to want anything, falling under the influence of womb-related derangement. A woman having a normal sex drive, suffering from uterine excitation. It was all very serious, very proper, and very, very misleading. Because what this all came down to, what the machines were treating, was desire, not disease, and calling it anything else, well, that made it socially survivable. The word orgasm didn't even enter polite conversation until the 20th century. Before that, there was paroxysm, or release. You're still here. Somewhere between a Victorian clinic and a late-night history rabbit hole, the room has quieted now. The machine is off, the patient is gone, and Dr. Clark is refilling his inkwell, readying his notes for the next day's ledger, but you're not watching him anymore. You're watching the silence around him, because for all the buzz and brass of the vibrator age, there rests something else humming in the background, something louder than steam, subtler than clockwork, silence, a great big, awkward silence around what these devices were actually doing. Because here sits the strange part. No one called it sexual, not in the ads, not in the journals, not in the waiting rooms, and certainly not out loud, which makes you wonder, how did they keep the lie going for so long? Let death start with the language. Victorian medicine was nothing if not committed to the art of euphemism. They had phrases for everything, long, dusty, Latin-influenced phrases that made the simplest things sound like divine punishments. A woman having a panic attack, exhibiting signs of female instability. A woman having a normal sex drive, suffering from uterine excitation. A woman having the audacity to want anything, falling under the influence of womb-related derangement. It was all very serious, very proper, and very, very misleading. Because what this all came down to, what the machines were treating, was desire, not disease, and calling it anything else, well, that made it socially survivable. The word orgasm didn't even enter polite conversation until the 20th century. Before that, there was paroxysm, or release, or a favorable outcome. It's like they built a medical system entirely on winks and nods, and for many of the women receiving treatment, that ambiguity was part of the appeal. Think about it. If you saw a woman in 1885 trapped in a marriage where affection is cold or non-existent, If your body is something to be tolerated, not explored, if the only acceptable form of pleasure is a vague sense of maternal fulfillment, and then someone hands you a medical note saying, you qualify for weekly sessions of pelvic stimulation under clinical supervision, you don't question the science. You don't have to push back. You show up. You keep your head high, your parasol straight, and your appointment card tucked discreetly into your glove, because no one can accuse you of impropriety if it's written on letterhead. That's the loophole. It's why women were so willing to accept the euphemisms, why they didn't demand clearer answers or louder truths, because vagueness gave them cover, and because somewhere inside the system, deep inside the layers of denial, there was something they wanted, maybe even needed. Now back to the doctors. Surely they knew, right? Surely at some point, someone in a waistcoat and pince-nez sat back and said, wait a second, is this? And the answer is, probably. But they buried it, deep, under professionalism, under pride, under a culture that viewed female sexuality as dangerous at best, non-existent at worst. To acknowledge the true nature of these treatments would have meant redefining everything, from medical ethics to marital roles to the idea of women as rational beings. So instead, they doubled down on denial. Doctors like Dr. Clark saw themselves as guardians of health, not enablers of pleasure. To them, pleasure wasn't the outcome, it was the problem. And when patients returned regularly, often urgently, they chalked it up to chronic congestion or recurrent instability. It never occurred to many of them that women weren't trying to get well. They were trying to feel. And yet, this mass delusion held together remarkably well for decades, because it suited everyone. The doctors got a clinical justification for what might otherwise be scandalous. Women got something they couldn't name, but clearly valued. Society got to pretend that feminine desire was still a myth. And in the rare moments when someone raised the alarm, when a clergyman or reformer hinted that maybe, just maybe, this treatment seemed a bit too stimulating, the reply was always the same. Sir, this is medicine. Still, the cracks were forming. You can see it in the advertisements that start to blur the line between clinic and consumer. At first, vibrators were sold to physicians only, medical equipment, no exceptions. But gradually, that changed. Manufacturers began designing smaller, more attractive devices. They gave them names like the Pulsocon, the Health Builder, and Dr. Swift's home electropathic instrument. Some were styled like hairbrushes, others looked like phonograph horns. One even came disguised as a foot massager, and by 1900 they were everywhere. In magazines, in department stores, in homes. Still branded as therapeutic, still wrapped in denial, but increasingly less supervised, less clinical, less polite. Because by this point, the women buying them didn't need an official diagnosis anymore. They just needed an excuse. And here sits the twist. As these devices became more accessible, more personalized, more obviously about pleasure, the medical world began to back away. Fast. It was too dangerous now. Too uncontrolled. Too close to truth. Doctors began quietly retiring the term hysteria. Medical journals reclassified it as a historical diagnosis. By the 1920s, the vibrator vanished from professional medicine almost entirely. In its place, silence, or if you fear keeping score, silence 2.0, now with added repression. But the damage or the freedom, depending how you see it, was done. The machines were out, the awareness was growing, the veil was thinning, and even though the words still weren't said, for the feeling was there, a hum, a flicker, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't set about being unwell. Maybe it was about being alive. And as we follow that thread into the next chapter, we'll see just how far the ripples spread. But for now, you can rest in the quiet realization that for decades, entire systems of medicine, morality, and marketing worked together to give women something they weren't allowed to name. And they got away with it by simply never calling it what it was. You're standing in front of a glass storefront now. It's 1897. The street outside is bustling with horse-drawn cabs, women in smart hats, and the occasional advertisement boy waving a paper. But what catches your eye is the neat window display right in front of you. Not in some back alley chemist's, but a well-respected apothecary near the city center. There, on a little velvet riser, sits something curious. A polished wooden box, a brass dial, a soft rubber attachment. Above it, a neatly lettered sign, now available. The Domestic Nerve Reviver. Gentle, soothing, approved by leading physicians. You blink, because you know what it is. It sets a vibrator, and you are not the only one who knows. See, by the end of the 19th century, what began as a strictly medical procedure has quietly become something else. Something commercial, something marketable, something profitable. Because let's just be honest, once the machines proved successful in clinical settings, and once doctors realized how popular these treatments were with their patients, the next step wasn't moral panic, it was monetization. The business of hysteria was booming. We're talking dozens of inventors, each trying to outdo the last. Improved designs, new attachments, greater speed, quieter motors. One ad in an 1898 Boston catalog describes its latest nerve tonic applicator as ideal for the busy physician and the discerning lady, may be operated by foot pedal, battery current, or steam pressure. That's right. Some of these things were literally steam-powered. Imagine explaining that to a customs officer. But the real shift wasn't in engineering, it was in audience. What had started in the private clinic was now reaching private homes. Middle-class women, especially those with disposable income and vague diagnoses, were suddenly the new target market. And the marketing was brilliant. It promised not just relief, but refinement. Reclaim your composure, balance your feminine temperament, restore vitality to the nerves. Discreet, silent, and elegantly housed. You almost admire it. How effortlessly these ads avoided saying what they meant. They never used words like pleasure or arousal or satisfaction. No, that would have been vulgar. Instead, they used words like vitality, harmony, energy, inner balance, as if what you were buying was a spiritual tuning fork. And behind this careful phrasing sat a simple, unspoken promise. You will feel better. You just once have to say why. Let's peek behind the curtain a little further. Apothecaries began stocking these devices on the same shelf as tonics and menstrual syrups. Department stores offered them alongside corset stiffeners and hairbrushes. And some women's magazines, the ones that also printed cake recipes and articles about modesty, started running product reviews. One 1901 editorial read, "After a long winter indoors, nothing refreshes quite like a brisk oscillation for the nerves. I found the device helps me sleep and improves my complexion. My husband doesn't understand it, but thankfully, he doesn't need to," which is honestly incredible, because that single sentence captures the strange genius of this moment in history. These women were not being fooled. They weren't passive. They were participating, with full awareness and plausible deniability. And that's where the real power shift begins. Because for the first time, women had access. They didn't have to go through a gatekeeper. They didn't need a prescription. They didn't have to convince a man that their feelings were real. They could simply buy a box, plug it in, close the door, and take their health into their own hands. Literally, you can almost feel the ripple effect. It's subtle, quiet, no marches in the street, no dramatic declarations. Just a generation of women discovering something sacred inside a machine wrapped in rosewood and euphemism. And while many were careful not to say too much, some did say something. Patient diaries from this period start to include phrases like, "I now look forward to Tuesdays. He finds me less disagreeable after I have had my treatment. I am not ill, but I keep the appointment nonetheless." And every now and then, a sentence that breaks the spell completely. I know what it is, and I do not care. Still, not everyone was so enthusiastic. The backlash was beginning to build. Some doctors started grumbling that women were becoming too reliant on these treatments, even when there were no observable symptoms. Others worried that widespread access to vibratory devices might encourage unhealthy behavior. You know, like feeling good, or having independent agency over your own body. Have that. A few religious leaders issued warnings about the moral dangers of unauthorized electrical stimulation, and in one particularly intense pamphlet, a medical ethicist wrote, "There is a risk, if not in the act, then in the pattern, that the body may begin to desire what the soul does not require." Translation: if you start enjoying this, it stops being medicine, which is sort of the whole issue, isn't it? As long as pleasure was an accident, it was permissible. But once it became the goal, even a secret goal, the entire system started to crack. Still, business was booming. Factories kept building. Women kept buying. Advertisements kept spinning their carefully tailored lies. And the vibrator, the thing no one could name, quietly became one of the first household electric devices sold to women. Before the electric iron, before the vacuum, before the toaster, a machine built on silence became a staple in the Victorian home, not because anyone said what it was, but because deep down almost everyone knew. You're sitting now in a small drawing room, not a clinic, not a department store, just a quiet middle-class parlor somewhere in the suburbs of Liverpool. The wallpaper is floral, the tea is steeping, there's a light rain on the windows, and across from you, a woman in her early 40s is writing something in a little cloth-bound journal. She pauses, glances over her shoulder, and then scribbles. Device arrived this morning. Cord fits neatly under the bureau. No questions asked. She underlines the word neatly. You don't know her name. Not really, but you know her type. She's one of many Victorian housewives who learned, quietly and cleverly, how to navigate the strange new world of domestic medicine. Because up until now, women have largely played the role of passive recipient in the medical model. The patient, the afflicted, the politely troubled. This is the part of the story where things start to feel a little subversive. But here they start to take charge. They write letters to one another in codes they've invented. They circle catalog items in pencil. Leave the page open where husbands will glance, but not look too closely. They invent excuses, headaches, nerves, insomnia, anything to justify the delivery of another parcel marked health supplies, delicate instruments. And behind closed doors they begin to build a kind of informal network. Not a conspiracy, not a revolution, just a quiet, shared understanding. We know what this is. We know why it helps. And we know what we are not supposed to say. Patient letters from this time, the few that survive, give us a rare peek into this hidden world. One woman writes to her sister, "You're sitting now in a small drawing room. Not a clinic, not a department store, just a quiet middle-class parlor somewhere in the suburbs of Liverpool. The wallpaper is floral, the tea is steeping, there's a light rain on the windows. And across from you, a woman in her early 40s is writing something in a little cloth-bound journal. She pauses, glances over her shoulder, and then scribbles. Device arrived this morning. Cord fits neatly under the bureau. No questions asked." She underlines the word neatly. You don't know her name. Not really, but you know her type. She's one of many Victorian housewives who learned, quietly and cleverly, how to navigate the strange new world of domestic medicine. This is the part of the story where things start to feel a little subversive. Because up until now, women have largely played the role of passive recipient in the medical model. The patient, the afflicted, the politely troubled. But here they start to take charge. They write letters to one another in codes they've invented. They circle catalog items in pencil. Leave the page open where husbands will glance, but not look too closely. They invent excuses, headaches, nerves, insomnia, anything to justify the delivery of another parcel marked health supplies, delicate instruments. And behind closed doors they begin to build a kind of informal network, not a conspiracy, not a revolution, just a quiet, shared understanding. We know what this is, we know why it helps, and we know what we are not supposed to say. Patient letters from this time, the few that survive, give us a rare peek into this hidden world. One woman writes to her sister, "Your suggestion proved most helpful. I have set aside the blue hour after luncheon for my application. The results are consistent." Another writes, rather cheekily, "My health has vastly improved since acquiring the device you recommended. I told Robert it suffs for the circulation." And just like that, you start to see the humor blooming underneath the formality. This isn't just about medicine anymore. It's about improvisation, about women using the tools they were given, or rather, the tools they were allowed to have, in ways that weren't technically approved, but weren't exactly forbidden either. It's the art of plausible deniability turned into a daily routine. And let's not forget, not all of these women were oblivious. Many of them knew exactly what these machines were doing. In fact, some of them started to prefer them over the doctors. Fewer appointments, no awkward eye contact, no waiting room chit-chat, just a moment of quiet. A sense of control, a rare kind of privacy. There's even evidence, whispered in the margins of old diaries and hinted at in personal ads, that some women began sharing their devices among friends, much like a good recipe or a favorite corset brand. And in that way, the vibrator became more than just a medical tool. It became a kind of secret currency, traded in winks and folded notes and subtle nods over tea. But of course, the secrecy was necessary, because while some women were quietly claiming space for their own experience, society hadn't exactly changed its mind about them. Remember, this is still a world where a woman showing enthusiasm for anything physical could be labeled unstable. A world where too much laughter, too much energy, too much attention-seeking could all fall under the umbrella of that one catch-all diagnosis, hysteria. It's like being told that any sign of aliveness might be proof of illness. So these women adapted. They didn't sit protest. They didn't write manifestos. They just kept their heads down and ordered what they needed. You think about that for a moment, about what it meant to find agency in a society built around denial, about what it meant to feel something, to want something, in a world where even the word want was suspect. And then you look at the machine again, sitting there on the side table, humming faintly. It's not stylish. It's not sleek. It looks like something between a dentist's tool and a butter churn. But for the woman who owns it, it's the first thing in her house that does exactly what it promises. And maybe that sits what made it so powerful. Because when almost every part of your life is shaped by compromise, by obedience, by appearances, by expectations, even a small act of self-directed relief starts to feel radical. Even if you never say it out loud, even if no one ever asks. You imagine now a quiet gathering. You may be 3 or 4 women, neighbors, cousins, friends from church. They've come over for tea, ostensibly to discuss sewing patterns or volunteer schedules. But tucked between the china cups and sugar biscuits, there's something unspoken in the air, as if we've all read the same catalog, as we've all highlighted the same page. And as the conversation turns, gently, toward nerves and sleep, one woman lowers her voice and says, "I've found something that helps." It says, discreet. The others lean in. No one says too much, but everyone understands. And later that evening, maybe one of them goes home and places an order. Restorative home therapy kit. The form reads, "For feminine vitality." She checks the box, signs her name, and when it arrives, wrapped in brown paper, unmarked, she knows exactly where to hide it. Right next to the sewing basket, between the cough drops and the camphor, safe and strangely empowering. Because for all the awkwardness and antique language, this was something real. This was a woman reclaiming her body in the only way she was allowed. Quietly, carefully, with a motor and a manual and a faint blush that she never had to explain. And for now, that was enough. You're sitting at the edge of a very polished sofa now. It's upholstered in floral damask, the color of chamomile tea. Across from you is a woman with reading spectacles perched on her nose and a pamphlet in her lap, one of those anonymously printed tracts handed out in better neighborhoods, usually after Sunday services. This one reads, "On the corruption of our daughters, the hidden dangers of unsanctioned stimulation." Ah, here it comes. Because as surely as women were finding quiet relief in these so-called medical devices, another movement was brewing, one that didn't find the situation charming, or scientific, or even tolerable. Wits have arrived at the backlash, and like most backlashes in history, it began in drawing rooms just like this one. Proper women, respectable women, or at least women who desperately wanted to appear respectable, were beginning to whisper about what was really going on behind the euphemisms, about how their neighbors seemed a little too enthusiastic about their nerve tonic boxes, about how their nieces were visiting doctors far more often than seemed strictly necessary, about how, maybe, just maybe, this wasn't medicine at all, and to them, this was dangerous. Not because they thought it didn't work, but because they feared that it did, that the treatment was real, and that its effect, that flush of relief, that unfurling of tension, might lead women somewhere they weren't supposed to go, toward independence, toward self-possession, toward a version of femininity that wasn't built on sacrifice. And so the campaign began. Drawing room morality, the kind where women turned against one another, not with violence, but with clucks of disapproval, passive-aggressive remarks, and a steady supply of concerned letters to local physicians. Some of these letters survive. I fear my sister-in-law is becoming too fond of her treatments. She often glows afterward and speaks with unfamiliar confidence. My daughter has requested her own device. She is unmarried. This strikes me as deeply inappropriate. We are Christian women. We do not tinker with God's designs. You can almost hear the pearls being clutched. But it wasn't just the moralists. Some doctors were beginning to turn skeptical, too. Especially the younger ones, freshly trained, trying to modernize medicine, and worried that a practice with this much patient enthusiasm might not be as clinical as they'd once believed. They started asking uncomfortable questions. If this is therapy, why does it need to be repeated indefinitely? If the symptom is vague and the relief is physical, are we treating an illness or creating a dependence? And most pointedly, are we crossing an ethical line without admitting it? Some reform-minded physicians proposed alternatives. They suggested talking cures, baths, dietary changes, anything that didn't involve touching anyone's nether regions or plugging in what was essentially an industrial-age magic wand. Others started removing hysteria from their vocabulary altogether, not because they didn't believe women were suffering, but because they did, and they knew the label wasn't helping. There sits a kind of irony here. The same system that once pathologized women for having feelings was now pathologizing them for seeking relief. They were wrong for being sad, and now wrong for trying to feel better. It's almost like, in Stay With Me Here, they were never meant to win. But despite the criticism, many women didn't stop. They just got quieter. They stored their devices under lock and key. They scheduled their treatments during afternoon rest. They avoided the more fashionable, more gossipy physicians. And they waited. Because something else was starting to change. Something deeper than scandal, bigger than machines. The culture itself. The 1890s and early 1900s saw a surge in women's activism, the suffrage movement, new education initiatives, rising literacy rates. Women were beginning to speak, to organize, to challenge the systems that told them how to think, feel, and behave. And within that shift, the vibrator became complicated. Was it a symbol of oppression, a holdover from male-dominated medicine? Or was it a tool of reclamation? A quiet, unspoken form of rebellion. Historians still debate this. Some argue that vibrators medicalized pleasure and reinforced the idea that women needed external permission to feel anything at all. Others point out that, for many women, this was the first time anyone acknowledged their bodies had needs, even if only behind a curtain, in a softly lit clinic. There's sets no neat answer, but what's clear is that the backlash didn't kill the story. It just shifted it. You start to see new patterns. Private letters written not to husbands but to friends. A rise in female doctors treating female patients, often using the same methods but with a different kind of gentleness. Small feminist reading groups discussing female vitality with air quotes and shared smirks. And at the heart of it all, a growing recognition that this wasn't just about medicine. It was about identity. It was about control. And the idea that maybe, just maybe, women didn't need to be healed. They just needed to be heard. You return now to that drawing room. The pamphlet has been folded. The teacups are empty. And the woman who once looked so rigid in her morality now stares quietly into the fire. Because even she, even the finger-wagging neighbor, knows someone whose steps felt better since starting treatments. Someone who laughs a little easier, sleeps a little deeper, and whether she said'll admit it or not, she sits probably curious. Just a little. You step quietly into a well-appointed study. There's a heavy desk near the window, stacked with case files and letters. The bookshelves are thick with German texts, many of them untranslated, and sitting in a worn leather armchair, adjusting his spectacles and preparing to revolutionize, or maybe complicate, everything, is a man with a large beard and a very small couch. Yes, it's his time to talk about Sigmund Freud. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to ruin everything, or depending on your perspective, finally give it a name. See, by the turn of the 20th century, the medical community was already beginning to distance itself from hysteria. The vibrators were quietly migrating out of hospitals and into homes. The diagnosis was starting to feel outdated, too vague, too female, too awkward. Enter Freud, stage left, with a theory so bold, so tangled, and so deeply Viennese that it would transform the way the world thought about desire, the mind, and yes, hysteria. He didn't invent the term, was ancient, but he did give it a new framework. He said, essentially, what if hysteria is instead a disease of the womb? What if it sits a symptom of repressed emotion, of trauma, of childhood conflict, of buried longing? This was radical, because up until now, hysteria had always been treated as a bodily issue, a problem with organs, with nerves, with fluids. The treatments were physical, tactile, mechanical. But Freud moved it into the mind. Suddenly, a patient's shaking hands weren't just a medical curiosity. They were a clue, a breadcrumb, a window into a hidden part of her psyche. And at the center of it all, sex, always sex, repressed sexuality, forbidden desire, Oedipal tension, libido redirected into the wrong pathways, like an emotional plumbing disaster. It was messy. It was speculative. It was wildly influential. You can imagine the reaction. Some doctors were relieved, a chance to finally stop massaging women into paroxysms and start referring them to someone with a chaise longue and a notebook. Others were skeptical, especially those who'd built their entire practice around treating hysteria as a physical ailment. Their machines were still humming, after all. But Freud's ideas caught fire, especially among intellectual circles where they felt modern, progressive, psychological. And to be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong. Many of the women once labeled hysterical were suffering, not from floating wounds or congestion, but from years of neglect, repression, trauma, and emotional suffocation. Freud gave language to that, sort of. Because here's the catch. While Freud introduced the idea of emotional causation, he also introduced some questionable assumptions, like his belief that most neuroses stemmed from unfulfilled sexual desire, or unresolved childhood experiences, or repressed impulses that had no safe place to go. And for women, that often translated into one tidy narrative. You sir not sick, you sir not crazy, you sir just subconsciously frustrated. You see the shift happening, don't ditch you. From your womb is misbehaving to your unconscious is full of longing, still medicalized, still someone else defining your experience, just with fancier vocabulary and a longer bill. And while some women found talk therapy genuinely helpful, others just found it to be, well, talking. No physical relief, no privacy, no clever euphemisms wrapped in velvet, just questions, endless questions, and couches. The famous couch. Freud's patients didn't sit face to face. They reclined, stared at the ceiling, and talked. About dreams, childhood, parents, slips of the tongue. It was intimate in a completely different way. And some historians argue that this was, in its own strange fashion, a replacement for what the vibrator had once provided, a sanctioned, structured way to express things that couldn't be expressed elsewhere. But here sits as where things get even murkier. Freud didn't just propose psychological causes for hysteria. He also decided which feelings were acceptable. Take, for example, the case of female orgasm. Freud made a distinction between clitoral and vaginal orgasms. He argued that mature women should experience pleasure only through vaginal stimulation, and that clitoral stimulation was a sign of immaturity. You read that right. So in one fell swoop, the father of psychoanalysis helped reinforce an idea that had already been smoldering in the background, that women's pleasure was fine, as long as it looked the way men thought it should, and anything outside of that, suspicious, possibly neurotic. You can imagine what this did to the vibe. The same women who had once found relief, mechanical or otherwise, were now being told that how they found it might be a sign of psychological failure. So now, in addition to wondering whether they were sick or immoral, they could also worry about being emotionally stunted. Neat. Still, Freud's influence was massive. The vibrator faded quietly from medical use. The diagnosis of hysteria was gradually retired, and talk therapy became the new standard for dealing with female trouble. But the ghost of hysteria didn't vanish. It just put on a new mask. Doctors still found ways to dismiss women's pain. They just called it neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion, or conversion disorder. And women still sought relief in private ways. The vibrator market didn't disappear. It just moved further underground, and later into beauty devices, facial massagers, and personal wellness tools that all claimed to be anything but what they were. So now you're left with this deeply strange moment in history. A period where doctors touched women to heal them, then decided that was inappropriate, then sent them to therapy to talk about not being touched, then told them the wrong kind of touch meant they were underdeveloped, all while society kept insisting that women were delicate, irrational, too emotional, and yet somehow still expected to be quiet, beautiful, and endlessly accommodating. It's exhausting just thinking about it. You take a deep breath now. Let that all settle, because here, in the early 20th century, the story is beginning to bend away from clinical procedure and toward personal autonomy. The couch has replaced the vibrator. The diagnosis has changed. The silence has not, but something that's stirring. Not just in therapy rooms or Dr. Fitt's offices, but in homes, in books, in quiet conversations between women who are starting to realize that maybe the problem isn't sit in their nerves or their dreams. Maybe it sits in the system itself, and once that realization takes root, there's no machine, no therapy, no Latin euphemism in the world that can undo it. You're walking now through a corridor of quiet endings, old diagnoses, retired treatments, the soft echo of outdated language being swept aside by newer, shinier ideas. The year is somewhere around 1925. The world has changed. The gas lamps are gone. The streets buzz with automobiles, and in the medical journals, the word hysteria is fading, being replaced by more modern-sounding terms that feel scientific, but carry the same old assumptions. No more wandering womb. No more paroxysms in the doctor's office. No more velvet boxes humming in clinics. But before we let the term hysteria go entirely, let's pause and look at its long, strange life. Because this wasn't set, just a medical term. It was a mirror. And for nearly 2,000 years, it reflected more about the fears of the culture than the realities of the patients. Remember way back in the beginning, when Greek philosophers like Hippocrates thought that the uterus could physically move around the body, causing coughing, choking, and emotional distress? That was hysteria. It came from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Literally, the entire concept was based on the idea that women were biologically predisposed to irrationality because of their reproductive organs. Flash forward to the Middle Ages, and hysteria was tied to demonic possession, spiritual weakness, or moral failing. Then in the 17th and 18th centuries, it became a favorite diagnosis of fashionable European physicians, especially for women who had the misfortune of being too educated, too opinionated, or simply too exhausted. By the Victorian era, it was everything. It was diagnosis. It was metaphor. It was societal anesthesia used to numb away the complexity of women's lives. And now it sets being dismantled. But don't celebrate just yet. Because while hysteria as a word might be leaving the stage, its shadows are still dancing behind the curtain. Instead of calling it hysteria, doctors start using terms like neurasthenia, female neurosis, somatic symptom disorder. These sound more respectable, more precise, but in practice many of them do the exact same thing. They describe emotional or physical distress without fully investigating the cause, especially when the patient is a woman. You walk now into a 1930s hospital room. A woman in her 20s is lying in bed. She sits, pale, withdrawn. She hasn't eaten in days. Her heart races. Her stomach knots. The doctors examine her, find nothing obvious, and declare it a case of nervous collapse. They prescribe rest, maybe some sedatives, maybe electrotherapy, maybe just a note in her file that says troubled but stable. Sound familiar? It should, because though the words have changed, the story hasn't. In fact, even today, some of this language still lingers. When a woman reports pain but tests come back normal, what is she told? It's probably just stress, maybe anxiety. Are you sure it's not in your head? The ghost of hysteria still whispers, not in steam-powered contraptions or clumsy euphemisms, but in disbelief, in the slow, systemic dismissal of women's bodies, their voices, their pain. And this legacy is why it matters. Because hysteria wasn't just a quirky chapter in weird medical history, it was a pattern, a centuries-long habit of blaming women for being human, for crying, for trembling, for needing something they weren't allowed to ask for. And even as Freud turned the conversation inward, and later doctors moved on to new diagnoses, the core problem remained. Women were still being misunderstood, still being managed instead of listened to, still being told what their bodies meant, without ever being asked what they felt. You sit with that for a moment, not in anger, not in shock, but in quiet recognition, because maybe that's what makes this story so strangely moving. It's not just about medical devices and obsolete treatments. It's about the long, slow journey of women trying to reclaim ownership of their own experience, even when the language failed them, even when the science forgot them, even when the diagnosis changed, but the dismissal didn't. And you begin to see it now. The shift, slow, subtle, but real. By the mid-20th century, women begin organizing not just for political rights, but for bodily autonomy. They demand better care. They challenge the diagnoses. They ask new questions. And some of them become doctors themselves. They bring new language, new research, new perspectives. They stop asking what's wrong with her, and start asking what's happening in her life. It's a small thing, but it's everything. Because the fall of hysteria isn't just about removing a word from a textbook. It's about making space for women to tell their own stories, without shame, without translation, without having to wrap their needs in velvet and call them something else. So the next time someone mentions hysteria like it's a quirky footnote, like it's just another weird idea we've outgrown, you'll know better. You'll remember the centuries of silence, the buzzing machines, the coded letters, the soft exhale behind a closed door, and you'll understand that this wasn't just strange history. It was a long negotiation between power and permission, between what was allowed and what was always there. You're in a living room now, not a parlor, not a clinic, just an ordinary 1950s suburban sitting room with floral curtains, a gleaming coffee table, and a discreet little wooden cabinet in the corner, the kind that might hold a stack of Reader's Digests, or maybe something else entirely. You lean in and peek inside, and there it is, a compact, battery-operated device with a curved handle, a rubber head, and a 3-speed switch labeled low, medium, and revive. It's not labeled a vibrator. Of course not. It's called the Relax-A-Scissor, or the Home Muscle Stimulator, or the Deluxe Beauty Tonic Wand. And it marks the next phase of this very strange history. The vibrator goes private. See, once medicine stepped away from the business of induced paroxysms, the market didn't vanish. It just rebranded. Because while hysteria was falling out of fashion in the clinic, demand for the feeling it once accidentally provided was very much alive. Especially among women who now had more money, more privacy, and just enough plausible deniability to keep everything perfectly respectable. The home appliance boom of the mid-20th century was in full swing. Electric mixers, hair dryers, vacuum cleaners, and, nestled quietly among them, vibrators. Disguised, of course, always disguised. No longer medical instruments, no longer tied to diagnosis. How they were personal, discreet, technically for muscle relaxation or facial tension, and their packaging, a masterclass in 1950s subtlety, restores feminine vigor, combats nervous fatigue, invigorates tired tissue. Still not saying the word, still pretending not to know, but you can feel it. The shift, the tone is different now, lighter, a little cheekier, a little bolder, because women are changing. Many are working outside the home for the first time. They're joining book clubs, reading psychology magazines, watching late-night television ads that hint, ever so softly, at something a little more exciting than skincare. And the devices, they start getting smaller, quieter, more portable. There are purse-sized models now, cordless ones, even rechargeable options by the late 1960s. A whole new generation of women is being introduced to what their mothers and grandmothers might have only accessed under the pretense of therapy. But this time, there's sets, no doctor involved, no medical charts, no handwritten referrals from men in waistcoats. It's just hers. You picture it now, a woman in her 30s, flipping through a Sears catalog at the kitchen table. She pauses at a full-page spread for the Energex Deluxe Tension Reliever. There's just a sketch of a woman smiling, clearly relaxed, and a tagline that says, "Because every woman deserves a little quiet relief." She folds the corner of the page, circles the item number, orders it by mail. When it arrives, she tucks it into her bedroom drawer, right next to the cold cream and the nail scissors. No one asks, no one tells, and slowly, the vibrator shifts from medical curiosity to personal ritual. But it's not all smooth progress, because alongside this discreet revolution comes a second wave of moral panic. The 1950s and 60s are still deeply conservative in many ways, especially when it comes to sex. Magazines print advice columns warning that too much self-focus can lead to marital distance. Some religious leaders frame self-pleasure as a sign of emotional deficiency, a way of withdrawing from one's duty as a wife. Even some doctors, now trained in psychoanalysis, cling to Freud's older ideas, claiming that women who prefer mechanical relief are arrested in development. It's the same judgment, just dressed in newer vocabulary. And yet, the demand keeps growing, so manufacturers lean harder into their disguises. There are now massagers shaped like animals, facial toners that vibrate gently, even slimming belts that just happen to stimulate the pelvis area. It becomes a kind of cultural game. How far can we go without saying it? And it works. The vibrator never disappears. It just hides in plain sight. But the biggest shift is still to come. Because while the device becomes more common, the conversation around it remains taboo. Women use it. They enjoy it. But they don't talk about it. Not openly. Not seriously. It stays tucked away, like so much else about female sexuality. Silent, sanctioned, unspoken, until, that is, someone breaks the silence. But we still get to her in time. For now, you return to that soft-lit 1950s living room. The fan is on, the curtains ripple, and somewhere, beneath the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the clock, a faint vibration can be heard, barely there. Not scandalous, not medical, just hers. Because what began as a cure for a fake illness has become, for many women, a quiet declaration of control, of privacy, of pleasure, even if no one's allowed to call it that. You're walking now through a department store in the 1970s. The linoleum tiles gleam under fluorescent lights. The air smells faintly of hairspray, polyester, and floor wax. You pass rows of blenders, then a section of electric toothbrushes, and finally, a modest little corner marked personal care. And there, without fanfare, without warning, is a shelf of devices with soft plastic casings, pastel packaging, and promises of wellness. You pause, because somewhere in the neat rows of scalp massagers and muscle toners sits the modern descendant of the vibrator. Except now, we're finally starting to call it that. Or almost. It's been over a century since Dr. Clark adjusted his cuffs and performed a treatment he would never name. Since medical journals whispered about paroxysms and pelvic congestion with furrowed brows. But here, in this brightly lit department store, the device has shed its stethoscope. It's no longer pretending to be a cure for nerves. And now it's being sold for something radical, something nearly unthinkable in the world where this story began. Pleasure. Real, personal, self-directed pleasure. No diagnosis. No chaperone. No need for permission. We have entered the era of reclaiming the story, but it didn't happen all at once. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the feminist movement was reshaping how people thought about sex, health, and control. Women were organizing, marching, publishing, not just for legal rights, but for bodily autonomy. And in the midst of all that, a handful of bold thinkers did something no one had done before. They said it out loud. They said what these devices really were. They wrote books, essays. They gave interviews where they used words like orgasm and clitoris, terms that had been absent, sometimes deliberately excluded, from medical texts for centuries. And at the center of this quiet revolution, a slim paperback published in 1970, written by a collective of women from Boston. Its name? Our Bodies, Ourselves. It's hard to overstate how much that one book changed things. Not just because it talked openly about menstruation, childbirth, and reproductive health, but because it treated women as the experts of their own experience. It included drawings, personal stories, and yes, instructions on how to use a vibrator. Not to relieve hysteria, not to soothe vague nerves, but for pleasure, for exploration, for self-knowledge. It said, you have the right to understand your own body. You have the right to touch it, to enjoy it. You don't need a diagnosis. You don't need a doctor. You don't need anyone else's permission. And that was revolutionary. Because for the first time, the vibrator wasn't being hidden behind euphemisms. It wasn't disguised as a therapeutic instrument or a lady's cyst nerve tonic box. It was just a tool for agency, for comfort, for joy. Of course, the culture didn't set flip overnight. You still couldn't talk about it openly at most dinner tables. Magazines were cautious. Television shows avoided the topic entirely. And advertisements? Still coy, still hiding behind soft lighting and words like invigorating. But the whisper was growing louder, and women were listening. Sales surged. Manufacturers started designing with women in mind, not just doctors, not just male inventors. Shapes changed, materials improved, and most importantly, the conversation began to open. It wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about permission, about undoing centuries of shame. Because here is the truth that has been sitting underneath this entire story. When you control someone's pleasure, how it's defined, when it's allowed, whether it's even acknowledged, you control their power. That's what hysteria was always about. It wasn't just a medical label. It was a way to silence something dangerous. Female desire. Desire that couldn't be explained. Desire that didn't wait for a husband. Desire that existed all by itself. Humming, quiet, persistent. And now, it was finding a voice. Not just in books or clinics or protest marches, but in bedrooms, in bathrooms, in the quiet spaces where women could finally ask themselves, without fear or apology, what do I want? And even better, how do I find it? You imagine a young woman now, maybe in 1974, sitting cross-legged on a shag carpet with a copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves open in front of her. She's holding a device she ordered from a mail catalog. It doesn't buzz like a 19th century steam engine. It doesn't pretend to treat her uterus. It's just hers. And for the first time, maybe in generations, she doesn't feel like a patient. She feels like a person, curious, awake, whole, because this moment isn't about hysteria anymore. It's about healing, not the kind that comes from a clinic, the kind that comes from truth. You sir in a doctor sits office again, but it's not gaslit. There are no fainting couches, no clove-scented gloves or rosewater tonics. The lighting is bright and overhead, humming faintly. There's a blood pressure cuff hanging on the wall, and a plastic model of a uterus on the counter, painted in cheery pastels. It's the 21st century now. The woman in the gown is still saying the same thing. Women have been saying for centuries. And yet, the age of medical apps and ergonomic exam tables, of wearables, AI diagnostics, and an endless stream of health content flooding your feed. I don't feel right. I am in pain. No one seems to believe me. We've reached the part of the story where everything looks modern, but some things haven't changed as much as you might hope. Because even though the diagnosis of hysteria has long since been retired, its ghost still lingers in how women are treated in medicine today. Let's talk about that. They wait longer in ERs. Studies, recent ones, have shown that women's symptoms are often taken less seriously than men's, especially when it comes to pain. They're more likely to be told their symptoms are stress-related. They're less likely to be given pain medication at the same dose. Some of that is unconscious bias. Some of it is cultural carryover. And some of it is, well, history. The long unspoken legacy of treating women's bodies as mysterious, as unpredictable, emotional, complicated. Used to have heard the phrases, haven't you? It's probably just hormones. Are you sure that's not anxiety? You stir just more sensitive than most. It's not the word hysteria anymore, but it sits the same tone, the same raised eyebrow, the same quiet dismissal, the same subtle suggestion that the real issue might be in your head. To defer, to be polite, to nod when the doctor said, everything looks normal. Let's not forget, for generations, women were taught not to trust their own perceptions, even if it didn't feel normal, even if something deep inside said this isn't set right. and the ripple effects are everywhere. Autoimmune disorders, which disproportionately affect women, often take years to diagnose. Endometriosis is still widely misunderstood and under-researched, despite affecting millions. And chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia, still stigmatized, still debated, still too often brushed off with that old whisper from the past. Hysterical. And yet, women keep speaking. You sir in a doctor's sits office again. But it's not gaslit. There are no fainting couches, no clove-scented gloves or rosewater tonics. The lighting is bright and overhead. Humming faintly, there's a blood pressure cuff hanging on the wall, and a plastic model of a uterus on the counter, painted in cheery pastels. It's the 21st century now, the age of medical apps and ergonomic exam tables, of wearables, AI diagnostics, and an endless stream of health content flooding your feed. And yet, the woman in the gown is still saying the same thing. Women have been saying for centuries, I don't feel right. I sense in pain. No one seems to believe me. We've reached the part of the story where everything looks modern, but some things haven't changed as much as you might hope. Because even though the diagnosis of hysteria has long since been retired, its ghost still lingers in how women are treated in medicine today. Let's talk about that. Studies, recent ones, have shown that women's symptoms are often taken less seriously than men's, especially when it comes to pain. They wait longer in ERs. They're more likely to be told their symptoms are stress-related. They're less likely to be given pain medication at the same dose. Some of that is unconscious bias. Some of it is cultural carryover. And some of it is, well, history. The long unspoken legacy of treating women's bodies as mysterious, as unpredictable, emotional, complicated. Used to have heard the phrases, haven't met you. It's probably just hormones. Are you sure that's not anxiety? You stir just more sensitive than most. It's not the word hysteria anymore, but it sits the same tone, the same raised eyebrow, the same quiet dismissal, the same subtle suggestion that the real issue might be in your head. Let's not forget, for generations, women were taught not to trust their own perceptions, to defer, to be polite, to nod when the doctor said, everything looks normal, even if it didn't feel normal, even if something deep inside said this isn't set right. And the ripple effects are everywhere. Autoimmune disorders, which disproportionately affect women, often take years to diagnose. Endometriosis is still widely misunderstood and under-researched, despite affecting millions. And chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia, still stigmatized, still debated, still too often brushed off with that old whisper from the past. Hysterical. And yet, women keep speaking. They write blog posts. They record podcasts. They share symptoms in forums and group chats and TikToks, building the kind of community that Victorian women could only dream of. They say this hurts, this matters, this is real. They say it loudly. They say it clearly. And they don't wait for permission anymore. That's part of the progress too, because while medicine still has catching up to do, many women have stopped waiting for it to define their experience. Here they're tracking their own data, pushing for research, calling out dismissive doctors, and demanding better ones. And yes, they're still reclaiming tools once wrapped in euphemism. The modern vibrator is no longer hiding in medical catalogs. It sits on shelves, in commercials, sometimes even next to the toothpaste in drugstores. It's part of wellness routines, self-care kits, and therapy practices. Not a secret, not a joke, not a cure for a made-up illness. Just a tool, one of many, that women are using to reconnect with their bodies, on their terms. And isn't it the final twist? That a device once designed to keep women compliant has become, in many ways, a symbol of autonomy. It's not just about pleasure anymore. It's about choice. About being allowed to say, this works for me without needing a diagnosis to justify it. About being the expert in your own experience. You picture it now, a young woman at a routine appointment, She says her pain isn't going away. And this time, the doctor listens. Not perfectly, not immediately, but he doesn't dismiss her. He asks more questions, refers her to a specialist. Progress hits slow, uneven, sometimes infuriating, but it sets happening because every time a woman refuses to accept nothing that's wrong as an answer, she chips away at a system built on centuries of silence. And every time she insists that pleasure, pain, and perception deserve equal attention, she rewrites a chapter of medical history that was never written with her in mind. So no, hysteria doesn't show up on charts anymore, but its legacy, still here, in how we listen, in how we diagnose, in how we choose to believe or not believe, the bodies that speak to us. And in that quiet choice, the story continues. You're not in a doctor set's office anymore, or a drawing room, or a Victorian clinic thick with lavender oil and polite denial. You stir in a bedroom, quiet, softly lit, entirely unremarkable, except for one extraordinary thing. The person here, maybe it's you, is completely in control. No permission slip, no diagnosis, no waiting room, no buzz of gaslight or hum of steam, just a quiet moment of autonomy. A long, strange journey has brought us here. From wandering wombs to electric tonic devices, from drawing room whispers to feminist manifestos, from hand-cranked treatments to battery-powered self-care. And somehow, through all of that, this little machine, this hum of brass and rubber and wire, has remained, sometimes hidden, sometimes denied, sometimes disguised as something else entirely, but always present, always adapting, and now finally understood for what it is. Not a cure, not a novelty, but a choice. Let Dists take a moment to breathe that in, because for centuries the story of the female body was written by others, by philosophers, by priests, by doctors with impeccable handwriting and no concept of consent. They labeled, they treated, they ignored. They built entire frameworks of medicine on the idea that a woman's feelings were suspicious, her desires abnormal, her pain exaggerated. And then, ironically, they created devices to soothe what they couldn't understand and called the results therapy. But here, in this present moment, the story looks different, because women are not just patients anymore. They're researchers, clinicians, writers, educators, inventors. They set are making the tools. They're writing the manuals. They're asking the questions that never used to be allowed. Like, what does pleasure mean when it isn't filtered through shame? What does health look like when it includes how we feel, not just what we can measure? What if we stopped using silence to keep things respectable? And those questions matter, because the legacy of hysteria isn't just about the ridiculous treatments. It's about the silence that allowed them to go unquestioned for so long. It's about how power operates through denial, and how denial can last for generations. But silence doesn't stand a chance when someone starts naming things out loud. And that's what's happening now. From best-selling books to viral Instagram posts, from TED Talks to teenage YouTubers explaining anatomy more accurately than half the textbooks you grew up with, the conversation has changed. It's open. It's honest. It's sometimes awkward, but it's finally real. And the vibrator, still here, still evolving, no longer sold as a cure for a disorder that never really existed. And now it's just one part of the toolkit for health, for healing, for happiness. It's in nightstands, lingerie drawers, travel bags, but more importantly, it sets in the open, in the light, and that matters. Because for hundreds of years, the female body was talked about like a mystery, as if its rhythms and needs were unknowable, inconvenient, even dangerous. But here is just the truth. It was never a mystery. It was just ignored. And now it sets being listened to. At long last, You close the metaphorical drawer now. The hum fades. The room quiets. You think about all the women who came before, the ones who couldn't speak or one else believed or never got the chance to feel what they were allowed to name only as relief. And you realize the vibrator didn't just survive medical history. It outsmarted it, wrapped in euphemisms, delivered in catalogs, hidden under bed frames and between the lines of patient diaries. You carried something precious through a dark, silent age. And now it hums for joy, for pleasure, for autonomy, for every woman who ever whispered something that's wrong and was told it's all in your head. Now we know better, and now we say it out loud, and we are not going back. Word count 1,384. Wind down final 300 words. So now we settle. Let the lights dim further. Let the story fade into a soft, warm hush. You've just traveled through centuries of strange diagnoses, dusty journals, whisper-coded letters, and buzzing brass devices disguised as medicine. And somewhere along the way, between the fainting couches and feminist bookshelves, we found a deeper truth. That history isn't just made of wars and kings and dusty dates. It's also made of small, personal revolutions. A woman finding comfort in a moment of privacy. A patient refusing to be dismissed. A voice saying softly at first and then louder, "This matters." And now you can rest in that, because the story doesn't end with scandal or shame. It ends with recognition, with the quiet knowledge that bodies, especially those long ignored, are worthy of care, of curiosity, of joy. No doctor needed, no diagnosis required, just the permission, at last, to feel what you feel. So go ahead, let your eyes close, let your breathing deepen. The machines have gone quiet now, the charts are filed away, and the world for the moment is soft and still. You're safe here, not because the past was gentle, but because you've made it through. And now you rest, sweet dreams.